Hey everyone, it's Finn Pope. Welcome back to another video. So there's a study out of Pew Research Center titled, "The Experience of U.S. Adults Who Don't Have Children." 57% of adults under 50 who say they're unlikely to ever have kids say a major reason is they just don't want to. 31% of those ages 50 and older without kids cite this as a reason they never had them. So this study was published just a little over a year ago, July 25th, 2024. And even though it's not brand new, and while the findings are not particularly shocking to anyone tuned into modern culture, I still think it's important because it highlights the very disturbing way in which a great number of both young and older adults view parenthood and having children. So I want to talk about that. I want to particularly focus on those aged 18 to 49, what the study found in that group, and then talk about why this crisis has arisen. Why do so many of us today view parenthood this way? So, as you just heard, the study, or the headline of the article says that 57% of adults under 50 who say they're unlikely to ever have kids say a major reason is that they just don't want to. Then later on in the article, it goes through a few more of the reasons for so many adults choosing to forego children. So I want to quote that. It says, "Reasons for not having children or being unlikely to ever have them differ between the older and younger groups. The top response for those aged 50 and older is that it just didn't happen. Meanwhile, those in the younger group are most likely to say they just don't want to have kids. Women younger than 50 are especially likely to say they just don't want to have children. 64% versus 50% of men in this group. Majorities in both groups say not having kids has made it easier for them to afford things they want, have time for hobbies and interests, and save for the future." In the younger group, about 6 in 10 also say not having kids has made it easier for them to be successful in their job or career and to have an active social life, close quote. All right, so I want to just address that last paragraph first. I mean, how could you possibly know that not having kids has made it easier for you to be successful in your job or career and have an active social life? You couldn't possibly know that. You've never had kids. It's impossible for you to know that. I mean, it would be like if I said, just use your imagination here, but if I had two pens and I said, this pen over here has made writing so much easier for me instead of this pen over here, but I've never used this pen. I've only ever used this pen. So I can't possibly know that this pen has made it easier to write than this one because I've never used this one. It's the same thing. It doesn't follow. So it just shows you, how deeply this belief that having kids basically enslaves you, rendering you unable to be successful in other areas of your life. It shows you how deeply that belief, that lie, is ingrained into our culture. Those are huge numbers. 64% of women, 50% of men just don't want kids. This is really bad. The family is the foundation of society. So without the family, society collapses. I mean, we're already seeing the fruits of this belief system playing out in our society. When you deliberately choose not to have children because you just don't want to, right? You make that choice because essentially you want to pursue yourself. You are contributing to the collapse of society. What you have when you have millions and millions of Americans now just choosing to forego having children for the sake of things that in the final analysis don't matter, things that won't last. They're leaving behind no great legacy, right? No one's going to mourn them at their deathbed. No one's going to carry on their bloodline for the sake of, climbing the corporate ladder, essentially. I also think it's kind of funny that it says majorities in both groups say not having kids has made it easier for them to afford the things they want, have time for hobbies and interests. Like, I just have a hard time believing that there's millions of Americans out there who aren't having kids because their hobbies and interests are just taking up so much of their time. They're so important and so necessary. Like, come on, you don't want kids because you want more time to scroll TikTok and scroll Instagram and go out drinking with your friends and that kind of stuff that literally does not matter. You're choosing to forego the actual adventure of your life for shallow self-indulgence. That is the case for most of these people. But, why has this problem arisen? What's caused the abandonment of the family in so many parts of our modern culture? What's led the majority of adults under 50 to say they just aren't going to have kids because they just don't want to? Well, there are several things we could point to, but I do think, without question, the biggest reason is the loss of God, the loss of traditional religion. Because when you reject God, you're left with yourself. You become the most important thing in your life. The self is elevated to the place of God, right? You've rejected God. And what's next in line? It's you. You are your own authority. You are the most important thing in your life. And you become the arbiter of truth and morality. The buck stops with you, basically. So then you really have nothing actually solid to base your life on. Right? It's just basically your whims. That's your foundation. You have nothing beyond yourself to strive for. You have only yourself. You have only yourself at a most fundamental level. But even yourself you reject, actually, because you've rejected the source of your being. So you have no understanding of yourself. And we've seen this play out in our modern society in so many different ways. But even yourself, you reject. So our culture is saturated with this garbage, just absolutely saturated with it. And I do want to acknowledge that we are seeing a very positive trend, I think, in my generation, back towards traditional religion, especially Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And that's wonderful. That's an absolutely beautiful thing. But why are we seeing that trend? Why are we seeing the trend back in this direction? Well, it's because people are craving truth. They're craving structure to their lives, right? They're craving the eternal. They're craving God. So I do think we're seeing a positive trend, at least in my generation, back towards traditional religion. But still, largely, this is a big problem in our society. And it kind of reminds me of the Sunday readings we had last week. The first reading was from Ecclesiastes, where it says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And so that theme was in all of the readings. And I do want to read the gospel reading for last week, because it's kind of about this, where Christ gives us the parable of the rich fool, is Luke 12, 13 through 21. And it says, someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to share his inheritance with me." He replied to him, "Friend, who appointed me as your judge and arbiter?" Then he said to the crowd, "Take care to guard against all greed, for though one may be rich, one's life does not consist of possessions." Then he told them a parable. There was a rich man whose land produced a bountiful harvest. He asked himself, "What shall I do? For I do not have space to store up my harvest." And he said, "This is what I shall do. I shall tear down my barns and build larger ones. There I shall store all my grain and other goods, and I shall say to myself, now as for you, you have so many good things stored up for many years. Rest, eat, drink, be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this night your life will be demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, to whom will they belong? Thus will it be for all who store up treasure for themselves, but are not rich in what matters to God." Close quote. And that one line where God says, "You fool, this night your life will be demanded of you," makes my stomach turn. Because we should all be spending time thinking about this fact, that God will demand God can demand our lives of us at any time, at any moment. And so we should also acknowledge that, one does not avoid this path simply by acknowledging the existence of God, right? And sort of stating in some way that we're called to serve him, to give our lives to him. It can't stop there, right? Even Satan and all of his demons acknowledge the existence of God, and yet they're the most evil creatures that exist, right? That's what James tells us in James 2:19. He says, "You believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder." So it's not enough to just acknowledge God. we must go further than that. We must surrender our whole lives to him. We must love him. I fear that a lot of us, though we claim to love God, we don't really make any effort to give our lives to Christ, to die to the world and to ourselves daily. That's what we're called to. That's the real adventure of our lives. So when we place ourselves as the highest good, as is the temptation for all of us, I mean, that's sin. In a certain sense, that's what sin is, to place yourself in the place of God, right? You decide what's right and wrong. So we all struggle with it, but we live in a culture that is designed to draw us into this way of life. But when we do that, we create hell for ourselves and others. It's like the line in Paradise Lost, that it's better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. And of course, that's speaking of the eternal hell, but it's true in our lives on earth too, that we can create hell for ourselves and for those around us. So the rejection of parenthood for selfish pursuits is leading to this hell. It's part of what's leading to the death of society. It begins with this spiritual death, this rejection on a personal level. And that leads to the death of our culture. When we become disoriented and divided within ourselves, it doesn't only negatively affect us. We don't like to think about this very much these days. We're so obsessed with our individual freedoms and our autonomy. We're so obsessed with ourselves that we don't really like to think about the fact that we're social creatures. And what we do matters. It doesn't just impact ourselves, our own lives. We're made to live in harmony with one another, right? Because we live in harmony with our Creator. So therefore, when one person falls, they take others with them. Your sin is not simply a private matter. Think back to the garden. First, think to before the fall, after God creates Adam, and he says it's not good for the man to be alone, right? From the very beginning, we see that we're social creatures, made to live with one another. But then think to when Eve tastes the forbidden fruit. What's the first thing she does after tasting the forbidden fruit? She gives some to Adam. Think also of Satan, right? When Satan fell, he swept a third of the angels with him. So we know that sin is not simply a private matter. Our selfishness, our choice to live these selfish, shallow lives doesn't only affect us. So what's the solution? Well, we have to turn back to what we abandoned. We have to turn back to God. We have to turn back to Christ with a repentant heart, receiving his offer of salvation, cooperating with his grace, falling in love with our Creator. That's the solution. To give ourselves to him without reservation. So don't seek to be great in the eyes of the world, because you already know that what the world has to offer you is empty and worthless. It amounts to nothing in the end. Instead, give your life to Christ. Surrender to the one who said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light."